Hi everyone, McKenna here. So this week we read chapter 3 of the Dueling Neurosurgeons as well as chapter 3 of the Brain Facts book. And in the Dueling Neurosurgeons book, we read about James Holman, and he was, I want to say the word adventurer. He was a traveler, and he was from England, and he traveled all over. And during his time, he was kind of considered one of the most well-traveled people in the world. And he wrote stories all about his travels, and he had gone all over. And this was really surprising to people because he is blind. And so a lot of people felt like it was not possible for a blind man to have made the journeys that he did, and it kind of called into questions the capabilities of blind and otherwise disabled people at the time. The textbook also talked, so senses was a big part of chapter 3. Especially we talked about synesthesia, which is when the messaging for the senses that you're receiving kind of gets crossed up, and so you can hear music instead of just hearing it. You might also like see colors or experience other things, or you can like say a word or see a color, and you can have some type of auditory input happening at the same time. This chapter also covered sensory substitution. So it talked about times when, instead, if someone can't see, they can kind of substitute that lacking sense with other senses. And so in James Holman's case, he used a cane to do echolocation. And there's a story of another blind gentleman who did something similar, except he would make clicks with his tongue in order to kind of experience the world around him. And he was also able to go on adventures, and sometimes they didn't always end well, like his cabin caught on fire at one point. But he says that living a life with those type of like accidents, or like he broke his heel at one point, is better than not living a life than living a life where he's doing nothing at all. And so the chapter kind of focused on those themes. And I think one of the key takeaways for me from this chapter was that the brain is wired in a certain way. There are certain areas of the brain that do certain things, but that it is also adaptable. So in the case of people who are blind or deaf or have different ways of experiencing the world, the brain compensates. For example, one of the examples in the book was talking about how a blind person's sense of hearing and touch might be more sensitive, so blind people make really good masseuses and massage therapists. And so the second thing that I took away from this chapter was that experience is within the brain, not within other areas. Okay, let me try that again. So what I mean by that is there's a specific quote that says, "It's not the eyes that see, it's not the ears that hear, it is the brain." And I thought that was really interesting, and that stuck with me about how, like, our eyes, for example, are an extension of our brain's ability to perceive and sense the world around it, but what we are experiencing doesn't have any meaning unless the brain gives it meaning. And so for the Brain Facts textbook, I do have a few notes written down here. One of my key observations was that voluntary movement within the brain does require planning, but that reflexes, like voluntary movement, requires planning within your brain. It requires your brain to think about what you're going to do and then execute the action. But there are actually some actions that we can take that don't require conscious thought or input from the brain at all. So, for example, reflexes, that is something where the decision, I guess it's kind of wrong calling it a decision because your brain's not really involved, but the action itself is caused from input from the spinal cord. And I wrote down a specific one, the flexion withdrawal reflex. So this happens when your body is encountering something potentially harmful. So like maybe you touch a hot stove or you step on something sharp. Your brain doesn't consciously or unconsciously think, oh, I need to pull away from that. That all happens within your spinal cord processing. And so it is possible to have movements that are actually not being driven by the brain. And I thought that was really interesting. Additionally, I have always heard of like the cerebellum, and I'd never really understood exactly what it did, but in the brain facts we learned that this is what controls your fine motor skills, or excuse me, the timing of your fine movements and things like that. And so speech, I learned, is actually very complex. You have to, and it requires a lot of work from the cerebellum, because your body has to make sure a lot of things are happening. Your diaphragm has to be moving at a specific like speed, your lungs, like the way you're holding your air, your face and mouth and tongue, like they're all doing things, and that is heavily governed by the cerebellum, like the timing of all of these things working together, which I thought was really interesting. Sorry, my neighbor started doing yard work, so I had to pause. But the last observation I made this week from the Brain Facts book is that movement is not just like a one-way signal coming down from the brain. It's actually kind of like a loop, because when you're like walking, for example, when you're like creating movement, your body is sending back signals of, okay, how's the balance, how's the pressure, the speed, everything. And so movement is really a two-way conversation between the input you're receiving and the movement and the action that you want to take. And so that was my third and final kind of observation from this week's reading.